Well, thank you for that, and I'm very pleased to be at this esteemed Norwegian event. I understand John Pilger is there. John is a very great friend of mine, and I've grown to respect him a great deal over the years. Okay, so I hope you treat him very well. Well, I have, of course, seen the debate about fake news, and when this term came up, perhaps a year ago, popularized initially by the US mainstream media, I thought to myself, you know what, this term, fake news, is going to turn around 180 degrees within a few hours and be used to criticize the oligarch-controlled press in the United States and elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened. So I was in fact, rather pleased with this term. I don't want to suggest that there isn't some newness to the phenomenon. That's not correct. There are some new things occurring. In particular, where we're moving into in relation to AI really is a potential change that human beings can have great difficulty encompassing. Essentially, if we're in a competition, as human beings have been for many years, between liars and people who detect lies, artificial intelligence means that the lies can be automated and pumped out en masse. That's not something that is happening yet to a degree where I think we need to seriously worry about it, but it will. Okay, now let's put some things into perspective. Thomas Jefferson in 1807, this is a couple of years after he had the US presidency, keeping in mind that the US presidency back then was a much smaller affair. There was no standing army of tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and the presidential role was much more of a figurehead role. But Jefferson, who's perhaps the smartest of the founding fathers of the United States, put it like this: nothing can now be believed nothing can now be believed which is seen in a newspaper. Truth itself becomes suspicious by being put into that polluted vehicle. That's his view from that time. And he goes on to jokingly assert that, well, perhaps a new newspaper should be launched with different sections. The first section being truths, and the last section being absolute falsehoods, and in the middle, various types of claims. And the first section would be almost non-existent, and the last section quite large, and the middle padding out the rest. So it's been that way for a very, very long time. And to a degree, while most people can perceive that the media is not trustworthy, and if you look at that on various opinion polls, you will see that that is quite a common perception amongst people, that the media is not trustworthy. There is a narrative that it is. And, well, why is that? Because I think the media is, in general terms, one of the most destructive forces that has ever existed. It has led to nearly every war that we've had, certainly the wars by democracies, all the big wars that you can name, at least in the post-World War II period, and to a degree even in World War II, were built up, their populations were mobilized on the back of lies from the Gulf of Tonkin incident, to the Iraq War, to the Gulf War. So the average death count per journalist, I did a calculation for US journalists recently, is something like 130 kills per journalist as a result of them not treating their function seriously, which is to provide, well, their supposed or claimed societal function seriously, which is to provide the truth, and instead spreading propaganda and lies of the major power establishments in the countries that they're in. So I want to, yeah, first of all, ground this debate about fake news with the reality that the news has always been fake. It has always been something that has been used to manipulate human populations en masse into absolutely disastrous outcomes in order for proprietors of news organizations to, yes, make profits by peddling salacious stories, but much more significantly, to keep their integration with existing establishments in those countries, and at a social level for each journalist and editor to ingratiate themselves socially with the very establishments they are meant to be policing. Now, the renewed talk about fake news, well, it's been taken up by Donald Trump in his critiques of CNN, for example. Okay, now, is it true that those responses by Donald Trump are motivated by a president in power trying to distract from critique of the press? Absolutely. Of course, that's the motivation. But is he nonetheless, in general terms, correct? Yes, in general terms, he is correct. CNN, I don't mean to pick on it unnecessarily. It's certainly not the only one. All the big establishment media in the United States, Fox News, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, are filled every day with very serious and misleading fake news. Okay. Now, why is the term being popularized other than politicians and other people who are criticized in the media using it to rebuff that criticism, whether that criticism is true or, as it very often is, false? Well, the US election, principally last year, saw an outbreak of uncontrolled popularism. Now, that popularism was harnessed by what is effectively neo-fascistic cultural sentiments. That's true. It was harnessed in various ways by those groups. But nonetheless, it is a democratic outburst that occurred principally because of the increased ease with which human beings can share information with each other, social media, small publishers, etc. And that, of course, has led to cultural change. It's led to cultural change, not simply because of underpinning reasons, which many people on the left talk about, such as the decline in US real wages from 1978, or by the concerns that people on the right talk about, for example, increased immigration, but rather because the establishment press is integrated with the existing order of things and is used to, has been used to create that order and to maintain it. Now, whether you see a decrease in the existing order as a positive or a negative depends on where you think that is going, and whether you stand to lose or gain in the process of that change. But let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine that do we accept that the press has a serious influence on society and the ideas that are passed around? Some ideas are pushed more than others, other ideas are suppressed, other ideas are introduced through the press. We all know that the press has been used to mobilize nations for illegal wars, for example. Okay, I say that in democracy, especially, the press is one of the principal controlling functions of the existing establishment, the existing order of things. So when that control structure can be worked around, social media, new publishers starting up with very little capital because of the internet, is that going to change the existing order of things? Obviously, if your claim was that the press is intimately part of the existing order of things, and there's a new press which is not part of the existing order of things, then obviously the order, the cultural order, and to some degree clearly the relative balance of who has power and who does not is going to change. So this has terribly frightened existing establishments, and those existing establishments are, of course, integrated with the establishment press by definition. So why we see such talk in the establishment press about the fear of fake news is not simply because it's another thing to be salacious about, not simply because there is to some degree a new phenomenon. It's because the change in the informational control system, of which the existing establishment press was a major component, leads to a decrease in power of the existing establishment and a decrease in power of the existing establishment press. So all those little publishers, social media, etc., are both in some sense direct rivals for establishment press power, and they are in addition something that causes the general establishment in many countries to feel that it is also losing its grip to populist forces which well up to populist forces that well up in the gap. Let me start again. So the existing establishments, including of course the press, which is integrated with them, see this uncontrolled phenomenon as a direct threat to their power and also to the existing order, which creates creates fear in themselves and also directly for the press itself. So the press talks about it a lot and tries to push forwards for there to be greater controls in the spreading of information. And this has then led to a very serious situation, extremely serious situation, where pressure has been applied to Facebook, Google, these giant new digital superstates, these giant intermediaries, to regain control of the informational flow system of the West, broadly speaking, to prevent outbursts of popularism and unexpected outcomes, of which the election of Donald Trump, or rather the failure to elect Hillary Clinton, is the most obvious example. And that was put in concrete terms in France in the Macron election. So feeling the heat of criticism, Facebook and Google decided to explicitly intervene in the French election. That is to say explicitly that they were setting up a mutual task force to prevent the spreading of what they called fake news during the French election. Now, is it true that fake news was spread during the French election? Of course. Fake news is spread in the mainstream press and small press and social media in every election. But the question of who determines what is fake news and what is not, of course, is decided by the forces that come together to make the claim and to make the censorship system involved. And of course, in this case, those forces wanted to see Emmanuel Macron elected and not Marine Le Pen. Now, of course, there are good reasons to be concerned about both of these candidates, but nonetheless, this was an overt intervention by Google and Facebook, American Silicon Valley companies, into the French election with the construction of a censorship system, which they said was there in order to stop what they assessed to be or claimed to be fake news. Okay. Perhaps we'll go on to a question. I can, of course, talk. I'd like to talk as we go ahead about where this is going in terms of artificial intelligence, and of course, I can talk in practical terms about the roles of various spy agencies and so on. But as I said, the attempts to influence the public have always been there for a very, very long time. There are some new elements, but I don't think that they're significant. What I do think is very significant is the debate by existing establishment press to say that certain forms of information spread need to be stopped. And that is then leading to a new norm of automated censorship by giant Silicon Valley companies of the information that we communicate with each other. That's very serious. Thank you. I mean, on the Syrian case, it's very clear that, of course, all sides have engaged in serious propaganda in that conflict, and of course, you can understand all the direct belligerents grasping every tool that they can in order to preserve themselves or to win. What's, I suppose, noteworthy is that the media power that exists for Bashar al-Assad and his allies in that war, Iran and Russia, is almost well, for Syria, it's essentially non-existent. For Iran, almost non-existent. And for Russia, pretty insignificant compared to the media power of those states like the United States, the UK, France, etc., which are or have been belligerents in one way in that war. I do think it is a very interesting question whether the situation has objectively become worse. Clearly, our ability to detect fake news by various establishments of different countries and at a popular level has tremendously increased because we're able to compare the outputs of different countries and we're able to use the internet to collect underlying facts and WikiLeaks is an example of that, as a primary source repository, a pristine primary source repository, which can be used to check, which can be used to both make and also check various claims. I think in a way, it has become worse, and that is the speed of information spread is so fast that false claims, salacious false claims, can spread around the world very, very quickly. Now, of course, they were always spread around the world, but with a slightly lower cost, a slightly higher cost to making false claims. Why do I say that? Well, the debate over whether a claim is false or not is rapidly displaced by new information, which is spreading everywhere. So there's a kind of churn or chaos in the spread of information, which means that debate or accusations about whether a newspaper produced fabricated coverage is swept aside. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that those debates ever really happened properly. You look at the fabricated front page stories of the New York Times, which were then spread, we must remember, not just by the New York Times, but nearly every single European, Australian, Canadian, etc. paper on their front page, under the basis that they can always just pass the buck to the New York Times. They were never held accountable for producing those fabricated front pages. It's a very interesting form of fake news. So we have, on the one hand, we have WikiLeaks. We don't speak about our sources in general, but we have said our source is not a state in this case. Okay, so that's that's our claim. Okay. There's been no presentation of evidence that claim is not a correct claim. What are the allegations, the formal allegations by US intelligence agencies? They obviously can't be trusted. Their business, CIA's business is both stealing information and fabricating information. That's its business. Its statements obviously can't be trusted. But what are its statements at their strongest? Its statements at their strongest is that there were hacks of the DNC. They provide no evidence. It's their assessment. There are hacks of the DNC that they believe was somehow sponsored by Russia. And this information then flowed through some third parties and came to us. And we published it. That's the US intelligence allegation at its strongest. They say explicitly that there's not an allegation that WikiLeaks conspired with Russia or conspired with the Trump campaign. That's not the allegation from the US intelligence services. But are there allegations that WikiLeaks did conspire with US intelligence services and the Trump campaign? Yes, every day. Those are made every day in the US press, fabricating even the strongest allegation of the US intelligence services. So here we have an interesting example where the statements of the CIA are more moderate than the statements of the US mainstream press. It's very interesting that you would think that the CIA would be making outlandish allegations, and then the press would be checking those allegations and somehow producing a less strident form of them. It's exactly the opposite.
Yes.
My concern is that someone has, at that time, that a young Democratic staffer had been murdered in Washington, D.C., shot in the back under suspicious circumstances. And yeah, there's allegations exist that are serious, that that Rich was in some way connected to the sourcing of WikiLeaks material. Obviously, we're never going to confirm that or deny it, but it is something that such an allegation about someone who's alleged to be one of our sources has to be very seriously checked. And it hasn't been very seriously checked by the media. In fact, there's a presentation that that's a conspiracy theory. Is it true that there are statements by Republicans that go well beyond what the publicly available evidence is in that case? That's absolutely true. It's been instrumentalized for political purposes. But is it also true that that's a serious case of someone being murdered in Washington, D.C. and needs to be investigated, as do the allegations that they had anything to do with WikiLeaks sourcing? It wouldn't matter to us. I think there's a always important question when you see a story appear in the press. What are the motivations behind that story appearing, both at the press level and whatever the sourcing is? But that's a separate story. It's okay for people to investigate that. In fact, in some ways, I wish those types of things were investigated more. But it's not okay to use it as a distraction from the content of the material. Obviously, in most cases, the material that is published, the leaked material, must take precedence, and provided it is true information, the public can rely on it. But machinations that occur to produce things in newspapers, yeah, they should be scrutinized, as should the nature of publishing organizations, who owns them, who controls them, etc. It's overwhelmingly the biggest threat to humanity. It's a much bigger threat than climate change. Artificial intelligence means, look, I've met some very savvy pathological liars, psychopaths. Very, very clever and hard to discern. Now, I'm sure all of you have met one or two of those types of people. Just imagine their capacity to lie and deceive multiplied by 1,000. It's not something that human beings can detect when it is at a certain level of proficiency. So, human beings for the last 15, 20 years, we have been documenting ourselves with billions of hours of video uploaded to YouTube, with all the thoughts and expressions that we have put on web pages and photo sharing, all the things that we have been searching for. The photos taken by Google Maps as it drives around streets, our current locations, which are communicated by smartphones, etc. An extremely rich, multivariable description of most of humanity, or at least that part which has any influence on the world. Very, very rich description. That is being used to train artificial intelligence systems. In fact, Silicon Valley, those people who are interested in this type of thing, we've kind of had a model of how it works, what form of capitalism it is. It's surveillance capitalism. Its business is to create so-called free services, bait, if you like your Google search engine, or the free software that Google puts onto Android phones, which power 80% of the smartphones worldwide, and use that bait to collect information from people, what you search for example, and then harvest that enormous, in some informational resource. In some models, it's a kind of resource extraction. It comes in and scrapes off information from Norway, and other countries, like a giant open-cut mine, and collects it in Silicon Valley. And then creates profiles and sells them to advertisers. Yeah, so it's the informational middleman. That's all changing. That model is completely changing. As a result of surveillance capitalism, as a result of harnessing all that information from the world, it's enough to then create and to train artificial intelligences. That's how, for example, Google Translate has been able to come up with 65 language pairs now, and it's getting quite good. It's kind of as good as an average human translator in many cases, and one that can work 24 hours a day, etc. So instead of thinking about Google Translate, think about Google Liar. Instead of simply translating information, it's actually translating this giant repository of how human beings behave into information that can be projected to human beings to cause them to act in particular ways. Google Liar. Now, already that's happening in a slightly in a more primitive form, which is to adjust the search rankings, for example. Now, as a result of the establishment fears in the United States from this unruly outburst of populism that led to Hillary Clinton not being elected, Google decided to invisibly re-rank nearly all the critical press, the establishment critical press. So both on the right and on the left. So yeah, from the World Socialist website, which went down by 60%, to WikiLeaks, which was pushed down by 30%, the Intercept pushed down 19%, Counterpunch pushed down about 40%. So that has had invisible effect on the behavior of human beings, just based on what they're searching for. Similarly for, if you go to YouTube and you see some video that's recommended or not, nearly all foreign policy critiques that are uploaded to YouTube have been demonetized as a form of economic censorship. Those producers who were producing content that was critical of US foreign policy, they don't get any money anymore, no money from Google. So this is much more insidious than the case of someone producing a finely crafted news story that is fake, such as that WikiLeaks documents are fabricated. That was the #1 fake news story in the United States, according to a study by Stanford. That fake news story was produced not by some site in Macedonia. That fake news story was produced by Newsweek, and who were subsequently sued, and they retracted the article. So instead of finely crafted false messaging like that, think at a strategic level. We're talking about bulk influence of human beings, because these giant new digital superstates operate at scale. So you can have bulk influence. But unlike previous efforts at bulk influence, for example, BBC or a national broadcaster coming up with a line and trying to culturally influence the entire population or politically influence the entire population, we're talking about bulk influence through mass individual targeting of individual psychological and individual psychology, which has been collected by these giant new AI organizations. So the end result means that humanity will not be able to detect what is happening to humanity because the lies, if you like, or the influence attempts are so fast and so sophisticated. So that then leaves us into a position where humanity can't see what is happening to it. And if it can't see what is happening to it, then it can't possibly change what is happening to it. It's a kind of a fake news apocalypse, if you think about it. Before that point, or we can discuss what is occurring as we're doing now. We can discuss it, we can change it to a degree. At some point, people cannot perceive what is occurring because it is too sophisticated and too fast. And at that point, we have no ability to discuss it. It's kind of like a fake information cloud that can cover the actions of these digital superstates and their allies. China has them as well. It's really only China and the United States. A fake cloud that cover them.
Yeah, sorry.
Wait. It's similar to what occurred during the Cold War, where literal fake clouds would be placed over missile sites. Yeah. Literal fake clouds, so that satellite photography would not be able to observe what was going on. Here we have an information fake cloud that can cover the actions of what is becoming the major power groups internationally.